Welcome everyone to this session of the Association for Global Political Thought Seminar Series for the semester of Spring 2022. My name is Ning Chang. I'm a political theorist in the Department of Government at Harvard University, and I am one of the co-organizers of the AGPT. I work on post-colonial theory and mid-20th century history of political thought in Southeast Asia, and that one selfish reason, as well as a multitude of many other reasons, is one of the reasons why I am particularly excited to welcome Professor Oguma to this session of the seminar series. The AGPT was set up to engage with multiple and diverse practices in the study of political thought, the ambition being to contribute to an ongoing pluralization of the field of political thought and political theory, as scholars from various standpoints and disciplinary locations continue to interrogate the boundaries of the field, question its constitutive categories, and expand the meaning of the enterprise. And again, I'm so pleased to be holding today's session with Professor Oguma Eiji, who is a professor in the Faculty of Policy Management at Keio University, where he's an expert in historical sociology, focusing specifically on national identity and nationalism, colonial policy, and democratic thought and social movements in modern Japan. A leading and indeed very well-known expert, Professor Oguma has written extensively in both English and Japanese on Japan's post-war social and political history, intellectual traditions, and contemporary developments. It's a great honor to be able to host him at the AGPT seminar series, and I look forward very much to his presentation this evening/morning, depending on where you are. I'm also incredibly pleased to welcome Josh Freedman as our respondent for today's session. Josh, who is an associate of the AGPT, is a PhD candidate in the Department of Government at Harvard. His research focuses on technocracy, bureaucracy, and the political theory of science and expertise in contemporary China. Before coming to Harvard, he lived and worked in Beijing and in Washington, D.C., researching and writing about social and economic policy issues in both China and the United States. So that's all from me. Over to you, Professor Oguma.
Thank you for having me. And it's my pleasure to make a presentation here and exchanging ideas with you. So I'd like to share my presentation slide. And
okay, you should be able to do that now.
Okay. Wait a minute. Sorry. Here is my presentation slide. And my presentation is titled as What is minzu in Japanese, minzu in Chinese, and minjok in Korean language. And subtitle says that the indigenization of the concept of race in modern East Asia. And here are the outlines of this slide. First, social historical construction of race as resistance. What is race as resistance? Okay, I'd like to explain in the first section. And the invention of minzuk. What is minzuk? It's a kind of the mixture concept of race and ethnic groups and nation. And it was invented in Japan in 1880s. And the concept was disseminated to East Asia countries. And the next is the conclusion. Okay. First section, social historical construction of race. And this is contemporary situations, ethnic identity influences in politics, because ethnic identity and the history of an ethnic group is a kind of narratives which could influence politics, and especially politics against neighboring countries. And I'm a sociologist, so that I have accustomed to the concepts of the constructionism. And I think there is no need to explain the concept of race was invented in 18th centuries. And until the 18th centuries, categories based on physical characteristics were not important in Western countries. However, after the concept was invented, it became key framework to categorize people in the world. And Asian peoples, including the Japanese, were categorized in inferior positions as yellow in the racial concept, which was constructed in the West. However, here is the main question of this presentation. And the main question is marked in red. Why and how did people in Asia and Africa who are categorized inferior have their own concept of race? What is the reason? And here is the main question of this presentation. Next. This is the key concept of this presentation, race as resistance. A Japanese anthropologist, Takezawa Yasuko, proposed the concept of race as resistance to understand the function of racial identities in Asia and Africa. According to Ms. Takezawa, race as resistance is race as created and reinforced by minorities themselves as agents who mobilize racial identities in order to fight against racism. And Professor Takezawa referred Afrocentrism, negritude movement, and independence movement in Asia as examples of race as resistance. Now we can see race as resistance could be seen as the archetype of indigenization of the concept of the race. That is one of the explanations why and how did people in Asia and Africa who are categorized inferior have their own concept of race. The main point is that the concept of the race was invented in 18th century in Western countries. However, Asian people and African people accepted the concept. Despite if they would accept the concept, they could be categorized as inferior. However, they accepted. What was the reason that they, Asian and African people, could utilize the concept as the race as resistance? Okay. The second, the invention of the minzu in Japan. It's a kind of race as resistance. And in the 1880s, Japan was a small country. And Japanese intellectuals felt a sense of crisis, colonization by the West. And they invented family state theory in 1880s. And according to the advocates of this theory, yeah, I cited Japan is a very small country and surrounded by rampacious enemies on all sides. And we'll have nothing to depend on but our 40 million compatriots. And given the state of the things in the world today, it is clear that Now is not the time to criticize patriotism as narrow-minded intolerance, not to weaken our power of solidarity. And they invented minzu nationalism. And they also claimed as follows. The Japanese empire consists of the great nation of one race. However, yeah, incorrect. The Japanese empire consists of the great minzu of one jinshu and in Japanese. And that shared the same history and the same pure blood. And the ancestor of the emperor is the earliest ancestor of all Japanese. Japan has never been conquered in the past thousands of years. Thus, minzu nationalism founded upon nations of shared ancestry arose as a response to threats posed by Western imperialism. But what was minzu? This is very important concept. And another Japanese nationalist claimed as follows in 1890. Okay, please pay attention. This is citation. There is a difference between white, black, and yellow people. Among these yellow, black, and white people, there are various countries of various minzu. But these various countries of various minzu have each their own history, custom, and territory. That is why national consciousness has been established. Here, minzu was a group having its own history and customs, even if skin color might be the same as others. In that respect, it resembled to the concept of the ethnic group. However, minzu was also assumed to possess its own territory that developed as an independent state. In that sense, it was akin to the concept of the nation. And here is, make questions. What was minzu? Minzu was a tool of unity and independence. In order to, for the Japanese intellectuals at that time, in order to differentiate Japan from China and Korea, which were ruling independence at that time, the concept of the race, which emphasized skin color or physical characteristics, was useless. And in order to retain territory and form an independent state, the concept of ethnic group was insufficient. Claiming we are an ethnic group itself didn't guarantee they should develop to the independent state. And the civic nationalism doesn't help create a unity that shares history and fate without political consensus or social contracts. The invented word minzu, however, was sufficiently flexible to satisfy the requirements of constructing the Japanese nation. Okay. May I move to next section? Okay. And the concept of the minzu was expanded to the neighboring countries. After the victory of the Russo-Japanese War and the annexation of the Korea in 1910, the Japanese government imposed Japanese nationality on Koreans, as well as requiring Japanese standard language, education, and loyalty to Japanese emperor. And what became the major discourse of Japanese politicians and intellectuals was to expand the concept of Japanese minzu to include Koreans. They claimed that ethnic groups from various parts of Asia who arrived in Japanese archipelago had been assimilated with the Japanese Minzu family state through the benevolence of the emperor, and claimed that Chinese was a brother deceived by the West, and Japan invented Manchuria and China in the 1930s under such a kind of the legitimation, justification. And this is the picture of the Manchuria government. Well, and you can see Japanese girls is centered on, and Chinese, Manchurian, Korean, and Mongolian surrounded Japanese girls, and they praised, unity and harmonious society of the Manchurian state. It was a puppet state of the Japanese army. And okay, so sorry. And it's somewhat similar to the racification. And Japanese assimilation policy might have been similar to the racification project that imposed the Russian language and culture on all subject populations within the Russian Empire in the 1880s and the 1890s. However, in the case of the Russia, Russian language had two different concepts. And what is Nazia and nationalists. Nazia means, Russian nation or some kind of concept. And nationalistic means, small parts of the ethnic groups which consist Russian Empire. However, Japanese Empire didn't have such a kind of the two kind of the concepts. They called themselves as only minzu. And small ethnic groups inside of the Japanese Empire should be merged with as Japanese minzu. Okay? May I move to next? And the dissemination of the minzu to Eastern Asia. And Japanese term minzu also spread to China as minzu and to Korea as minjuk, and using the same combination of the Chinese characters. And Sun Yat-sen, the founding father of the Republic of China, developed Sanmin-chui, three principles of the people, and democracy, welfare, and minzu. And in the 1890s, Sun stayed in Japan, and where he was hosted by Japanese nationalists. And he might be affected from Japanese discourses of the minzu. And the concept of minzu in Sun text is very difficult to express in English. And Su argues that Han minzu was different from Manchurian minzu. And in that context, minzu, which Sun adds is akin to that of the ethnic groups. However, Sun also argued that Han, Mongols, Tibetans, Manchus, and Muslims should have been merged into Chinese minzu to fight against Western colonization. And Sun also insisted that all Chinese states had been composed of the single minzu since unification by Zenji Huang in the 3rd century before Christianity. Thus, minzu possesses both history and territory. And the minzu has thousands of years of history. and which had not been never conquered by others. Which had kept 1,000 years of independence. That was the reason Chinese minzu should pursue independence. And soon further argued that minzu signified communities formed by harmonious natural process, whereas state signified collective aggregated by armed power, artificial politics, and the social contract. Without any artificial effort, minzu should maintain unity and harmony inside of the minzu. And ultimately, Sun has conceived the Chinese minzu as a group that had maintained territorial sovereignty from ancient times, was characterized by the absence of domestic conflict and unified against aliens, and should be developed into an independent state. Here we can see that the concept of minzoku, which was invented in Japan as a resistance, could be applied to the political situation in other parts of Asia. And next, dissemination to Korea. And Woodrow Wilson advocated of self-determination for colonial people at the Paris Conference in 1919s. And that triggered the Korean independence movement. And the beginning was that a Japanese newspaper translated Wilson's self-determination as means of self-determination. And this translation then appeared as Minjuk self-determination in same Chinese characters combination in a Korean newspaper. And next, a Korean student studying in Tokyo published a statement demanding freedom from colonial rule and Minjuk self-determination. And on March 1st, 1919, Korean activists declared independence of Korean Minjuk. And this declaration was issued in the name of representatives of the Korean Minjuk. And it was dated March 1st of 4,000 years after the foundation of the Korean state. And here we can see the Japanese conceptualization of the Minzu as race as resistance became an ideological tool of the race resistance to Japanese colonial rule. It's a kind of the boomerang effect. Okay. Here is we have reached to the conclusion. Minzuk as an indigenized concept of the race was invented by the Japanese as race as resistance. And it spread throughout East Asia. And claims the unique culture, domestic harmony, unity against powerful enemies, and victim consciousness, and external aggression in the name of the liberation of the deceived brother may, in fact, be the features of race as resistance in general, not specific to Eastern Asia, maybe. And this Eastern Asian experience has revealed a variant of race as resistance, but others may exist elsewhere. Thank you for attention.
Thank you so much, Professor Oguma, for that really revealing presentation. Josh, over to you.
Okay, let me figure out my situation here. There we go. Okay. Thank you so much, Professor Oguma. I thought this paper and this presentation was extremely fascinating. I learned a lot. As you know, I'm not a Japanese expert by any means, but I actually am very grateful for this opportunity as a result of that, because I have the opportunity to learn a lot more. And I thought that you did a great job of highlighting the different facets of the concept of minzoku or minzu. And in my response here, I'm going to use minzu, not because I am trying to do some kind of cultural imperialism from a Chinese perspective, but because I'm more familiar with the Chinese language. And if I try to do either the Korean or Japanese pronunciation, we might be in for something much worse. So I'm going to use minzu, but know that I'm trying to express the concept as it applies in whatever country context that is relevant. So I don't want to go over all the points of the presentation because it was very thorough, and I hope people also had a chance to read the paper. But I want to start by talking a little bit about this idea of race as resistance, which plays a very important role, of course, in your story of how minzu evolved and became central to identity in Japan and the rest of East Asia. I mean, I think that to start from the broadest sense, you're talking here about the indigenization of race, but my first instinct would be to think about minzu as obviously a combination of race and nationality or something, but closer to nationality. And so the first thing I wanted to ask was, in terms of comparative perspective, we could think about how nationality developed in the West or in other contexts. And we tend to, at least in my understanding, associate it with, say, the French Revolution, the decline of the ancien regime, the overturning of the existing way of doing things, and the domestic social upheaval, which was a crisis which spurred the creation of modern national forces. And in the case of Japan, of course, you highlight the role of crisis, but it was the crisis of a threat of Western imperialism. In general, it seems to me that the concept of race as resistance would mostly be used to look at how racial groups push back against racial oppressions in their own country. So for example, with the work of Takezawa Yasuko, who you point out her work, who points to, say, Afrocentrism, it was a transnational African solidarity movement, but it was, for example, in the case of the US, about overturning the domestic forces that kept a minority subjugated within the country. And I wonder how easily the concept of race as resistance in that light fits into the case of Japan. Because you argue that in the case of Japan, minzu emerged out of the fear of the threat of Western colonialism. And it was sort of a national consciousness in response to that. But what's distinct about it in the case of Japan is that it's being used in favor of a national majority that's already in power in the country, right? In the case of African Americans, for example, the minority group is using race as a tool against the group in power within the country in which they live. Or if we think of Qing Dynasty China, you very helpfully brought up the example of the Han versus the ruling Manchu dynasty, right? Liang Qichao and Sun Yat-sen and others highlighted the concept of the Hanzu as a way of highlighting the difference with the ruling Manchu dynasty to push for power within the country. But in Japan, we're talking about it as a sort of overseas threat, not a minority within the domestic concepts. And as part of that, they rejected this idea of minzu as purely racial, with the quote that you highlighted in both the paper and in the presentation, that they wanted to differentiate themselves from China and from Korea. And I'm assuming as part of that also there's a sense of superiority there, right? That Japan, especially after the Meiji Restoration, thinks of itself as somewhat superior to China and Korea. So unlike the Pan-Africanists, who are generally disempowered across the board, part of the importance of minzu seems to be from the fact that it's both feeling a threat from the West and feeling superior to Korea and China. It's not only about victimization, but also about a sense of superiority. So I think that brings up two sort of interesting ways of thinking about this. The first is, I wonder what role the sort of domestic overturning of the social order in, say, the Meiji Restoration plays in developing this sense of minzu, not only as an external threat, but also this sense that just like in, say, the European or the French Revolution case, we have this domestic upheaval, overcoming, throwing out the old regime, putting in something new. What extent do you think that plays a role in developing this concept of minzu, which would, chronologically seem to fit as well? It seems plausible that that would also play a role. And I think that would be a very interesting addition to your story, in addition to the international threat. And then thinking about this idea of race as resistance in Japan, I just wonder if, because of this idea, it's a mix of victimization and superiority, I wonder if race and resistance is the way to think about this. And you also say that you think it's an ideal type in the Weberian sense. And I'm curious a little bit what you mean by that, and why you think that this is an ideal type that might encapsulate all the features, when to some extent the race as resistance seems less clear in the Japanese case to me than, say, in the Chinese case, where they're in the middle of their century of humiliation. They don't have power domestically or internationally at all, right? So that's the sort of second part. And the third part of this sort of line of thinking that I was trying to tease out here is, I totally agree that this idea of minzu is a flexible concept, right? And it changes meaning, but we can think of it potentially changing meaning in a number of different ways. So one way would be that it's a concept that encompasses multiple ideas at the same time. So, different people looking at the same thing at the same time can take away different things from the concept, right? In that sense, it encompasses multiple different meanings. Another sort of way that it could be flexible is that it means different things at different times, but each person in whatever time period sees it the same way. And so in your story, I was sort of wondering which you think is more accurate as a representation of how minzu changes. Is it a chronological story where in the late 1800s, minzu means one thing, and in the 1920s, minzu means another thing, et cetera, et cetera? Or is it that at each point in time, everybody looking at it is able to take away multiple different meanings from it, and thus giving it a very flexible nature as a concept? That was my first broad point, which I'm sure was way too overwhelming, but don't worry, I have more. So sorry about that. I also, the other thing that I really wanted to sort of draw out here was the politics of this, right? In your introduction, you noted that narratives of ethnic identity shape politics, and the example of Putin, I think, is a very apt one. But I'm also wondering the extent to which politics shapes the narratives, right? If we think about it the other way. And so for that, I want to talk a little bit about the Chinese case, which I think is quite interesting and fits perhaps into your story. So as you note, the concept of minzu started in Japan and then spread to China. The wonderful picture you have of the 5 different nationalities and the Manchu Empire, of course, reminds us that under Sun Yat-sen, he thought that there were supposed to be 5 different minzu within the Zhonghua minzu of China, which didn't include the Japanese, but did include the Tibetans, the Mongolians, the Hui Muslims, the Han, and the Manchu. But then when he ended up giving power to Chiang Kai-shek, Chiang Kai-shek moved us closer to getting rid of the 5 nationalities and instead adopting a single Zhonghua minzu, a single Chinese identity. He said there is no 5, this 5 thing is not correct. It's just one, and we just have this unity. And given the disunity of that period, the desire for unity certainly makes sense. And that it could be, that China could be envisioned as a single nationality corresponding with the sort of national territory of all of China, right? And then we turn to the communists, who are obviously in opposition to the nationalists, and they end up taking a much more multicultural position, right? They argued that China had multitudes of nationalities and that was actually a good thing. One key reason for this, as many scholars have pointed out, is that they wanted to get political support from these minority groups by standing in opposition to the nationalist hard line that said there's only one, right? Obviously, many minority groups did not like this forced integration into one national identity. So the communists were able to capitalize on this, taking the opposite political position and saying, actually, there's, we can take as many nationalities as we'd like, right? On the other hand, there's this Marxist undertone here where Marxist thinking has a very complicated relationship with this idea of nationality and whether national self-determination makes sense. On the one hand, it should all be irrelevant in the context of, a grand economic struggle between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie. So this idea of nationality doesn't make any sense or is irrelevant. On the other hand, it was very practically useful for nationalists or for Marxist-inspired revolutionaries everywhere to embrace some concept of national self-determination. And as Tom Mulaney argues in his very interesting book called Coming to Terms with the Nation in China, the CCP realized that when they came to power, they ended up having way too many ethnic groups, and they couldn't actually give them all political representation as they had promised when they were fighting the nationalists for power. And so as a result, they engaged in this very complicated quasi-scientific classification campaign to determine what the real true minzu were, or shaoshu minzu in the country, the minority groups. And they came up with a fixed number based on a bunch of different categories, many of which did not exist before this project. And they merged groups together and they sort of made it fit so that it vaguely fit with this idea of what a minority group or ethnic group should be. And then there are many other groups who over time have applied to the Communist Party to say, hey, we want to be a minzu, why can't we be a minzu? And sometimes they're allowed and sometimes they're rejected. More often than not, they're rejected. And the number has been fixed at 56, as one of your pictures showed, with all the happy minorities in their native dress, saying all 56 minority groups together. That's been the same since the 1970s. So, here we see a bunch of different contradictory forces. We see this sort of overt recognition that China is multicultural, at least up to 56. But in reality, a lot of the policies, of course, have pushed minority groups into becoming more and more Han. And they're not actually able to keep their whatever national characteristics or minzu characteristics that they would. And a lot of this story seems to be determined by national political conflict and the need for political compromise at specific times. So under this Zhonghua Minzu, this Chinese nation, there's both a nation, there's 56 smaller nations. And so it's both a nation and an ethnic group, which makes it a nation state and a state full of nations. So I'm curious, bring this back to Japan after that very long-winded story. I want to know more about your thoughts on the role of the state in determining and enforcing the boundaries of minzu and shaping the way that people in Japan and any other countries that you're familiar with understand the meaning of the term. So has the state and its policies or the outcomes of maybe some domestic political competition, either democratic or under authoritarian rule, shaped this idea of minzu itself? Or do you think it's more of a cultural development? As we, Sun Yat-sen and others have said, it's more of a cultural component rather than a state nationalism. And so because I study politics, I want to know more about the politics behind all of this. And the very last quick question I have, I'm just curious, I didn't see the word civilization come up in your presentation. I wonder what you think of the relationship is between minzu and civilization, however that's defined either in the Chinese or Japanese or Korean context. I sort of think of those as very related concepts, and a number of contemporary Chinese intellectuals, at least, have thought about this idea of civilization and the role of domestic culture or a larger civilization. I wonder if you see any connections there with this idea of minzu. So thank you so much for your presentation. my apologies that there are many comments and questions in there. I hope that this sparks a great discussion, and we're really glad to have you here. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Josh, for that wonderful conversation and interlocution. Professor Oguma, would you like to respond?
Okay, and Joshua mentioned many of the questions and the comments, and I would like to summarize his questions was centered on, two questions. And one is, relationship between victim awareness and superiority awareness. And the another is relationship between real politics and narratives. And I'd like to answer, in the context of the two questions. And I'd like to mention other comments from Joshua in these answers. Okay. And first, in the case of Japan, in 1880s and 1890s, Japanese intellectuals shared strong, inferiority complex and a sense of the crisis. And that was before the victory of the Sino-Japanese War. And I have researched many of the discourses of the Japanese politicians and the Japanese intellectuals, and they felt strong inferiority complex against China. And because China was a more big, huge country than Japan at that time, and China possessed, Western weapons, which was imported from Western countries. Of course, most of Japanese culture was affected from China, and Japanese intellectuals was aware of such a kind of reality. After the victory of the Sino-Japanese War and the Russo-Japanese War, Japanese intellectuals changed their, mindset. And yeah, you mentioned that Japan was in the position of the superiority against China and Korea was the story after the victory of the Sino-Japanese War. And invention of minzu by them was before Sino-Japanese War. And at that time, as I wrote in my paper, Japanese was annoyed by the many uprising inside the Japanese archipelago and strong feudal domain awareness, and Japanese people themselves were lacking of the unity. And that was the situation in 1880s. And it was 1880s, the peak of the imperialism of the Western powers. And so that, and the concept of the minzu was invented in the specific context of the 1880s. And after that, and Japanese intellectuals, the Japanese government changed their mindset after the victory of the Sino-Japanese War, the Russo-Japanese War, and tried to expand the concept of the minzu to Koreans and Taiwanese. After the annexation of the Korea and Taiwan, but I omitted the complex history. However, there are so many conflicts between the concepts of minzu and the reality of expansion of the empire of Japan. And I have published 2 books in English. And one is titled as The Generality of the Japanese Self-Images. And it dealt, how there are so many conflicts between the reality of the expansion of the empire and the concept of the minzu. And another one is, titled as The Boundaries of the Japanese. And it dealt with the issues of the how Japanese empire implemented legal system and education system to Koreans and Taiwanese, and also registration system as a nationality system, legal and in the as a part of the legal system, and I examined discussion inside of the politicians and bureaucrats, and should we should they implemented Japanese legal system or registration system or education system to Korean or not? And if we would have interest in such a kind of the political process which has affected the narratives, and you can check my book. Okay. And the more important thing is that, in my understanding, very complex relations between superiority and inferiority and victim awareness is not specific to Asian countries. And yeah, in this presentation and paper, I dare to distinguish Asian concept of indigenized race from Western concept. However, I remember that Ernest Renan, French intellectuals, who declared the concept of the civilized nation, and he argued that nation is not concept of ethnic group or race. French nation is created by daily poor. You remember that, such a kind of concept, which claimed by Ernest Renan. It's a kind of the official narrative of French republicanism. Okay. However, that declaration by the Ernest Renan was made after the defeat of the French-German War. That was a declaration calling French people to unify against Germans. And if you would examine the whole text of the Ernest Renan, he referred Germans are based on ethnic nationalism, whereas French are based on civic nationalism. We French were defeated by Germans. However, in the future, we can defeat them. That was the concept of Ernest Renan. And sometimes political sciences and research of the political thoughts try to distinguish, ethnic nationalism from civic nationalism. However, in my opinion, so-called civic nationalism was invented in the context of the defeat and inferiority complex. And my point is that I'm a specialist of the Japanese history, and I have researched many discourses and political decisions by the Japanese government and Japanese intellectuals. And they employed different understanding of the minzu in specific context of the political situations. In the case of the, they would feel, superiority against China and Korea, they understood the concept of the race in the context of the, expansion. And after the defeat of the Second World War, they lost all of the, expanded area, colonies, and they changed understanding of the minzu. Very harmonious, small countries as Japan. And yeah, that reveals that their narratives are affected from political situations. And they employed, different understanding and in the context of the, inferiority and superiorities. However, at the same time, once they employed a understanding of the minzu narratives, they started to move in the direction which was limited by the understanding. It's a kind of a reflexive process. And I think I answered many of your questions, I think. And yeah, I remember that I once met with a Chinese anthropologist. And he said that, once he visited the small villages which wanted to be recognized as an ethnic group. And they welcomed, the anthropologists to dinners and so on. And it shows that, recognition as small minzu and small ethnic groups is politics. However, once they would be recognized as an ethnic group, politics would move in the direction which is limited to the understanding. And okay, last thing I'd like to mention. I once was surprised to find a term, American race, in the discourses of the early 20th centuries in the United States. In the early 20th centuries, the term of the race or nation was not fixed, even in English text. And some people in the United States use, the term of the American race to refer white people, and which included, former Swedish people, former English people, former German people, so on. But what was American race? And after mid-20th centuries, American intellectuals invented new term, ethnic group. Ethnic group was not used in early 20th centuries, as far as I know. And what was ethnic group? Connotation of the ethnic group is that, okay, they would have their own culture or language or tradition or something, but they would never pursue independence. And they are part of the American nations. That is the connotation of the ethnic group. And political situation in the mid-20th centuries required the invention of the term. That is my opinion. So that my point is that each language in the society had, its own development of the concept of the race or something or nations. However, sometimes political science tend to, have a kind of the, cultural imperialism. And I means every concept in the world should be explained by the English text in the 21st century. However, can you explain English text in 19th centuries by the term of your own English? That was, I would like to say. Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much. And I think that is where we come, as I think we often do, to the requirement to the need for anthropologists to take over. But thank you so very much for the wonderful and generative conversation between the two of you, Professor Oguma and Josh. In the interest of opening it up to Q&A, I will stop the recording here.